We're diving into some really mind-bending stuff today, all from the work of archivist Elias Thorne. The idea is simple, but huge. What if the biggest decisions in history weren't really decisions at all? What if they were just moments of pure desperation? We're going to peel back the curtain on the documents that built our world and find the real, messy, human stories hiding behind them. All right, so let's just jump right in with a question that's going to shake things up a bit. We all learn in school that history is this grand march of progress, right? Smart people making smart, rational choices. But what if that's just a story we tell ourselves? What if it's not even close to the truth?
Yeah, what if the real building blocks of our civilization weren't things like logic and diplomacy, but something way more basic, something a lot more fragile? I'm talking about raw panic, gut-wrenching paranoia, and just sheer physical pain.
And that brings us to the core, absolutely explosive idea from the Shadow Annex. It's this. Those history-making treaties, they weren't these grand acts of statesmanship. They were just acts of pure desperation. The archivist, Elias Thorne, he puts it perfectly. They did not sign to save the world. They signed to escape the room. That is a huge claim. So let's put it to the test and look at 4 moments where this might have actually happened. Okay, first up, we're going all the way back to 1494. We're talking about the Treaty of Tordesillas. The one that sliced the entire known world right down the middle. So the textbook version is pretty straightforward, right? A powerful pope, Alexander VI, lays down the law like some kind of global referee. But the Shadow Annex tells a completely different story. A story about a man who wasn't in his right mind. A man who was having a full-on psychotic break, trying to literally stitch up a hole he thought he saw in reality itself. And the trigger for all of this? A condition called horror vacui. It's basically a deep, paralyzing fear of empty space. So for the Pope, looking at a blank spot on a map, that wasn't just an area to be explored. No, it was a terrifying existential threat. So you're probably asking, how does something like that even happen? Well, the Annex suggests it was a perfect storm. First, the Pope had been eating rye bread that was, well, it was tainted with ergot, which is a seriously powerful hallucinogen. Then, pile on top of that 4 straight days with no sleep. So when he's forced to just stare at this giant empty map of the Atlantic, his mind just broke. That empty space on the map became a real, terrifying void. And in that moment of absolute terror, he grabs a pen and he doesn't draw a line, he slashes it across the map. He wasn't trying to divide the world between Spain and Portugal, he was trying to stitch the hole closed. So when he screamed, "It is closed," that wasn't some grand political declaration. It was just the sound of a terrified man relieved that his nightmare was over. All right, let's jump forward in time. Case file number 2, 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. This is a big one. It's basically the birth certificate of the modern world as we know it. Again, the history books paint this picture of reason winning out over religious warfare. But the Annex, it says the real driving force was something much more primal, an absolutely unbearable smell. Think about that. The idea is that these diplomats signed this world-changing treaty just to get out of a room that was literally making them sick. Thorne actually has a name for this, olfactory dissonance. Here's what was happening. The rooms were filled with these super sweet, cloying perfumes. Why? To cover up the stench of death and disease from the war raging outside. And that contradiction, this beautiful smell trying to hide something so awful, it basically scrambled their brains. It led to nausea, migraines, even paranoia. I mean, listen to this quote from a French diplomat's journal. It's just visceral. He wrote, "The sweetness is a demon. I breathe the rose and I feel the maggots crawling in my lungs." Wow, that's not a metaphor. The poor guy was having a total sensory breakdown. The air itself felt like a lie. And when you're in that state, the fastest way out isn't to win the debate. It's just to sign the paper and run. Okay, on to case number 3. Now we're in the 20th century looking at one of the most infamous treaties ever signed, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. We all know the story. The treaty was too harsh, driven by revenge, and it led straight to World War II. But the Annex asks us to look closer, not at the politics, but at the room itself, the famous Hall of Mirrors. What if that magnificent hall wasn't a symbol of peace, but an unintentional torture chamber for the mind? Just picture it.
For weeks on end, these leaders, the men who had just overseen the depths of millions, could not escape their own reflections. Everywhere they looked, hundreds of versions of themselves staring back. Imagine the psychological pressure of that, no escape. And this optical onslaught, it hit each of them differently. Woodrow Wilson, he started to believe the reflections were a jury of ghosts judging him. Francis Clemenceau got vertigo from all the glaring light. And Britain's David Lloyd George, he started to experience depersonalization, where he couldn't even tell which reflection was the real him. I mean, their minds were literally coming apart at the seams. And this quote from Lloyd George, this is what the Annex presents as the smoking gun. He wrote, "I signed the clause on the Ryland today simply to make the reflections stop glaring at me." Think about that. A decision that set the stage for another world war wasn't about strategy. It was just to make the mirrors stop looking at him. Okay, this brings us to our last case file, and honestly, this one might be the most chilling of all. We're at the Yalta Conference in 1945. The war is almost over, and the big three are carving up the future of Europe. Now, the standard story is that a healthy, cunning Stalin just plain outsmarted a sick Roosevelt and an aging Churchill. But the Annex claims it was something way, way darker. That Stalin wasn't just a negotiator, he was a biological warrior. He didn't win by being smarter. He won by actively, deliberately weaponizing their failing health against them. It was a brutal, two-pronged attack. For Churchill, Stalin knew about his dependence on alcohol, so he forced these endless vodka toasts, knowing it would cause memory blackouts and ramp up paranoia. And for Roosevelt, who had severe cardiovascular failure, Stalin weaponized the clock. He'd schedule crucial meetings late into the night, pushing Roosevelt to the absolute brink of physical and mental collapse. And here's the cold, hard reality of what was happening. While Roosevelt was supposedly deciding the fate of nations like Poland, his brain was literally being starved of oxygen because his heart was giving out. At that point, you're not thinking about maps and borders. Your body is just screaming for survival. He gave up Eastern Europe, the theory goes, because his body was telling him, agree to anything, just end this meeting and let me rest. So, when you look at all four of these moments together, you start to see this really unsettling pattern, don't you? It suggests that a signature on a piece of paper isn't always a sign of consensus. Sometimes, it's just a sign of surrender to some kind of unbearable pressure. Let's just quickly recap the argument here. The New World, divided because of a hallucination. The modern nation-state system, born from a bad smell. The Treaty of Versailles, shaped by a room full of mirrors. And the Cold War, kicked off by weaponized exhaustion and biology. It's a lot. And that leaves us with this huge, lingering question. We like to think our world is built on a solid foundation of reason and logic, right? But what if it's not? What if our whole civilization is just teetering on the fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes just plain bizarre breaking points of the human mind? What if history isn't some grand rational plan at all, but just a long series of desperate people trying to escape a really uncomfortable room?
Please like and subscribe.